people have talked about and said already about this book. I don't know if people know the name Margaret Busby. She is, in fact, the granddaughter, in a similar way that Cathy is the granddaughter of Ralph Casimir. She's the granddaughter of George Christian, who was a Dominican early Pan-Africanist who actually went to Ghana. But he was older than Ralph Casimir. But Margaret, who has been to Dominica, although she lives in London and was born and brought up a lot in Ghana, she's now a leading publisher, editor and writer in the UK. And she says about this book, a welcome opportunity to discover some much neglected Pan-African history is provided with his biography, perceptively written by his granddaughter. The book's blend of treasured personal memories and rare family photographs combine with the reclamation of crucial details about his role as organizer in the Eastern Caribbean for the UNIA and Black Star Line, and attention to his dedicated literary activity and connections. I feel so much better informed for having read this book, and so will you all when you read it. And Lennox Honeychurch, who's very sorry he can't be here because he's stuck in Barbados, has said, it will surprise a new generation of Garveyites that in the early 20th century, Dominica produced a vibrant core of activists led by Ralph Casimir, a deeply committed and passionate agent of the UNIA who, against great personal odds, strove for change and respect for black people. So that's all an important resources and accolade for this really special and perceptive book. So I just want to hand over to Cathy and say I much admire what she's done, because she really did have to do an awful lot of research. So what you're seeing in this book is something extremely original. And it's written with great perception and affection about her grandfather, whose story is of a man whose very important contribution to the march to independence of this island. So over to you, Cathy, who will tell us much, much more. Thank you so much.
Lost my glasses. Right, thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to see you, and I know that there would have been more people, but they have had all sorts of challenges that I'm sure you're aware of. So you're the ones who braved it all and got here. Thank you very much indeed. So that's my first thanks. And before I begin to talk about my grandfather, I want to thank Polly, my publisher, who's been really helped me along all the way. Every so often she would gently say to me, and how are you getting on with the book, Cathy? And apart from that, she's been a very reflective and very sensitive editor, which has really helped the process and helped me to produce this book. I'm really sorry my parents are not here tonight, because they're both 95, and at the thought of coming out, my father took to his bed. So, anyway, but they, much earlier on in the process, they were both very helpful. Lots of stories about my grandfather, and also a lot of support with my grandfather's papers, and so therefore with my research. And I just want to, not here is Jennifer Fidel, who has really helped to make this place look so beautiful tonight and helped me with a lot of the presentation. So I just want to say a thank you in her absence. I think she's just really busy. And also here is I want to tell you that there is also the grandson of one of the key players in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and that's the grandson of Casimir MacLean, who you will hear me speak about later on. Right. Right, as you know, this Black Man Listen is the biography of my paternal grandfather, Joseph Raphael Ralph Casimir. He was born in 1898. He was a political and literary pioneer who led the Garveyite movement on the island. He promoted the Black Star Line, preached Pan-Africanism, and wrote for the Negro world. I wrote this book to address the fact that his story was missing from the history of our island, and also to honor his memory. He was born in the coastal village of St. Joseph, and here in this slide I just mark out where St. Joseph is situated, and also a very old postcard about the time when my grandfather would have been living in St. Joseph, as a view of St. Joseph from the sea. And I plan in this talk to outline what influenced his radicalization, some of the challenges he faced, and this will be punctuated by some extracts from the book. Here is again some more views of St. Joseph, one more view of St. Joseph, really, so that you can have an idea of what a village on the west coast of Dominica, sorry, is it the west? Yes, the west coast of Dominica was like at that time. So you know, the sort of lives that people lived, and also a photograph of my grandfather as a 13-year-old growing up in St. Joseph. My memories are mainly around the visits that he made to my childhood home at Kings Hill. And I'm going to begin it by reading from my book and focusing on my memories of my grandfather growing up. My earliest memories of my grandfather are of his visits to our family home at Kings Hill on the outskirts of Roseau in the 1950s and 1960s. Perched midway up the hill, the house, which was destroyed by the fury of Hurricane David in 1979, was a sprawling bungalow with wide verandas at the front and back, surrounded by a garden of fruit trees. Grandpa would arrive in the late afternoon while it was still light and the long shadows were beginning to fall. He often sat on the dark green wooden bench with a drink clinking with ice cubes, while I, with my siblings and cousins, played hopscotch or skipping games on the glacis opposite a broad-leaved mango tree. There, he would have long conversations with my maternal great-grandmother, Mary Lucy Olivace, sometimes known as Ma Percy, as she sat in her cane rocking chair. Their voices were a background to our play. When I was very young, Grandpa would put up with me bouncing on his knee, and we would sing a nursery rhyme about galloping horses, which would end with him pretending to drop me between his legs. I thought it was highly entertaining. As I grew older, he would more than likely find me immersed in a book. He would ruffle my hair and say, "What are you reading, child? Hope it's teaching you something." Or, "You should find a good light to read in. Careful you don't spoil your eyes." As was customary, on his arrival we would all stop whatever we were doing and troop over and kiss him dutifully and wait to be dismissed before resuming our activity. We always knew when Grandpa was about to arrive. We could hear his whistle as he approached. He made an art of whistling, and it was my first introduction to classical music, as he would whistle classical tunes, and it was from him that I learned the names of Mozart and Chopin. Grandpa always left us by 8 o'clock. He would kiss us goodbye, don his hat, and stride off into the darkness, whistling his way down the hill towards the town. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather was appointed to a job at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa as a statistician. A few days before our departure for Addis Ababa in November 1963, just as the sun was lowering in the west, preparing for its dramatic drop in the sea, Grandpa made a journey up the hill. As always, his approach was heralded by whistling. We sat around while he was being refreshed with a glass of lime squash, and he talked to us about our luck at moving to a country with great traditions. He spoke in admiring terms about Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. He was the emperor, king of kings, the Lion of Judah. His people had never been enslaved, and they had defeated Mussolini and his Italian occupation. How lucky we would be to live in Africa, the birthplace of some of our ancestors. I got the feeling that Grandpa wished he could accompany us on what he obviously viewed as a wonderful adventure. He spoke of the pride of the Ethiopian people, who had not been defeated or had their spirit broken. It was an important conversation, as before this, I just knew that we were going to some place in Africa. Many of my contemporaries seemed to find this news a bit shocking, as we were all very ignorant of life on that continent. In 1916, my grandfather gave up his employment as a pupil teacher at his local school and moved to Roseau, which was the capital. It was 12 miles from the village, but only accessible on foot unless one had access to a horse, donkey, or mule, or if it was wealthy enough to use the weekly boat. And these pictures are views of the town of Roseau at this time. As you can see, and was attested to by Hesketh Bell, Dominica was one of the most neglected colonies of the British Empire. We had poor roads and dilapidated housing. At that point, he was employed as a messenger for a local newspaper, and then he learned the trade of bookbinding. By 1918, he had taken up a position as a clerk to the influential lawyer Cecil Raw, who later became Attorney General of the Leeward Islands in 1937. During the 3 years that followed his move to Roseau, Grandpa became acutely aware of the discrimination and discrepancies within the society he lived in. It was clear to him that power and privilege resided with the white colonialists and the mulatto elite, that intellect and aptitude mattered less than the opportunities available by virtue of heritage and pigmentation, that there were few opportunities available for ordinary black Dominicans like himself, and that change was necessary. The slide shows the few carriages that existed on the island, and you can see that the people travelling in those carriages would have been of the elite. The First World War may have been fought a long way away from Dominica. However, many Dominicans signed up to join the armed forces. The islands sent more recruits than any other colony in the Leeward Islands, and most of those who went were the sons of labourers and small proprietors. The war also brought economic hardship to Dominica. Fewer ships visited, and there were a lot of severe food shortages. My grandfather learned from his reading and from the returning soldiers that on their arrival in Europe, the black soldiers of the British West Indian Regiment were mainly assigned to the worst jobs. He observed that life in Dominica was really hard for the returning veterans and that employment opportunities were few, except for back-breaking work on the estates. He was also aware of the treatment of the returning black soldiers in Britain, as there were accounts of rioting and soldiers who were killed. This is a poem, just an extract from a poem called Forgotten Heroes by my grandfather. It's a poem that pays homage, really, in a way, to Macrae's poem about Flanders Fields. But he used his poem to describe the storied battlefield as a site of West Indian valour in the face of adversity. Those who governed Dominica were an elite, as I said before, firmly linked to the concerns of the European and mixed-race landowners. The class structure was dominated by white inhabitants on the island, and there were not many. The mulattoes formed the middle class, and the black majority were at the bottom. Mulattoes were property owners, and their children were tutored or educated privately in Dominica or abroad. And he was moved to say that when he wrote in an article that the people have no voice in the government of the island. There are a few non-officials who sit on the Legislative Council. They are appointed by the administrator, and whenever they oppose anything in the council, the administrators rules. So if the administrator opposed however many people had voted for a proposal, then the proposal was lost. He felt that the system of the government was a rotten one based on a form of slavery. My grandfather also wrote a hard-hitting essay which was published in the Negro World and entitled What Ails Dominica. He indicated that there was an unrest among the people of the island and outlined the issues that beleaguered the black population because of the unnecessarily prohibitive laws, high rates of exchange, high costs of living, low wages, profiteering, a poor educational system, lack of proper steamship, and therefore difficulties with travel, communication, and that he laid this all at the door of Crown colony rule. He railed particularly against the education system, claiming it to be one of the worst amongst the West Indian islands, and accused the government of failing to enforce compulsory education. Literacy rates in Dominica were very low, and a few years later, the Wood Report stated that there was less than 30% of the population were literate. And this slide, it just confirms that this article had a great, was received really well by the rest of the West Indian Islands, and many felt that he had said something that they had wanted to say but hadn't perhaps been brave enough. And then it's accompanied by just what I think is a market scene, just the ordinary people of Dominica. Having been exposed to the ideas of the UNIA through the Negro World newspaper, he and two friends, Casimir MacLean and a tailor, Louis Gardier, were fired up with enthusiasm and resolved to form an organization to fight what they saw as discrimination against ordinary people of their society. the Friends held a public meeting in December 1919 to announce the formation of an organization called the Dominican Brotherhood. This is just, you can see a copy of the Negro World newspaper, and as they would have seen it then. Sorry. This slide, the three men were soon joined by others, and together they created and signed the following pledge, and this slide is a copy of the pledge. There were 12 members of the founding meeting. At the second meeting 2 weeks later, which had received extensive coverage in the Dominica Guardian, and it reported that there were 150 people in the packed hall, with others crowding outside. The membership, by 6 months later, membership had reached 800, and the Negro World had become the most circulated newspaper on the island. And you can see here that there was a very serious intentions in this pledge, signed by Francis Louis Gardier, Herbert David Severin, J.R. Ralph Casimir, Casimir Morancy, whose grandson is sitting here, and Henry J. Elwin. This is Marcus Garvey, as you can see, this was the sort of certificate that the members of the UNIA would have received, attested to that they were members. The whole Casimir family were involved, and here's a photograph of seated at the front is Maria Casimir. Behind her is her daughter Meredith and her son Ralph, and next to her, her younger son Hubert. The Casimir women were highly involved in the very active members, and they really led the ladies' division. Casimir became the agent for the Black Star Line in Dominica, and there were many investors many investors encouraged by his involvement were attracted by the offer, and Dominicans bought hundreds of shares. Many were small tradespeople and peasant cultivators who were attracted by its promise to provide them with their own shipping. A number of prominent Dominicans also saw this as a lucrative opportunity. And I know that generally when you talk about the Black Star Line, it's generally said to me, oh yes, Marcus Garvey was just trying to take everyone back to Africa. But that wasn't really the case. He thought that ultimately if people of African descent wanted to return to Africa, then his line could take them. But really, it was viewed as an opportunity for people of African descent to travel without being subject to harassment, and also as a lucrative business opportunity, because they suffered a lot of discrimination on the other lines, despite often there were examples of people who would have paid first-class passages on what was known as the White Star Line, and yet they would have to wait until all the white people were served before they were allowed to sit at table. And this is also, here you can see an example of a certificate that all those investors would have received from. The Seditious Publications Act was designed in particular to suppress the circulation of the Negro World, and it was passed by most of the Caribbean island legislatures. But this was not so in Dominica, and it was opposed by Cecil Rawle. But it was at this point that Casimir took up the role of clandestine supplier to subscribers of the paper on other islands and to the Gold Coast. The banned newspapers would be sent to him, and he would pass them on to willing black seamen and other sympathizers who would then smuggle them to other islands in the Caribbean and to the Gold Coast. Gramba himself faced opposition from Dominica's powerful bourgeoisie. At that time, he was employed as a legal clerk to Rawle, and although Rawle had opposed the suppression of the Negro world, he wrote to Casimir in August 1920, stating that he would either have to cease his political activities or seek new employment. And you can see here a transcript of the letter. Your recent political activities and speeches have given great offense to the majority of my clients, both white and colored, many of whom threaten to withdraw their work from me if I continue to employ you. These articles and speeches have been exceedingly offensive in tone and stupid in manner, and certainly in no way help the cause which you profess to champion. While I cannot and do not intend to control your political views, I am certainly not going to allow my practice or my reputation to be injured by your buffoonery. In response to this ultimatum, my grandfather chose to leave Rawle's employment and left his job in 1920. He supported himself on a stipend he received as a cantor at the cathedral and his work as a freelance bookbinder. The highlight of 1920 for the UNIA in Dominica were the emancipation celebrations, which, even for the first time, they were organized on a grand scale. There was a colorful procession with a band, and 1,000 were at church service in the local cathedral, followed by a rally at the local hall with highly political speeches and a variety show in the evening. And at this point, I'm just going to read you an extract of that. It was a glorious day, the sun beaming down upon them as they celebrated 86 years since the Emancipation Bill had been actioned, and 82 years since the end of enforced apprenticeship. On the eve of emancipation, those who governed the island had feared that once the island's 14,175 slaves were freed, that there would be drunkenness and disorder. However, in true Dominican fashion, many simply went to Mass in thanksgiving. It is also to be remembered that at the end of the period of enforced apprenticeships, in 1838, the slaves had started full free with nothing. Days before, John Longley, Dominica's Lieutenant Governor, read out a declaration. The houses in which you live and the grounds which you have planted are not yours. He assured them if they continued to work as they had before for their master, he would allow them to remain in his house, and you may plant your provisions on his grounds. This is what I advise you to do, what I know the Queen would wish you to do. The master, of course, would receive compensation for the loss of his slaves. The slave owners of Dominica received a total of £275,547. Remember, that was then, that would be millions now. Throwing back determined soldiers, the marchers continued to their destination of St. Gerald's Hall, set back from the road behind the cathedral. It was a solid building which had been the place of worship for Catholics before the central part of the cathedral had been completed, and was now used for meetings and official ceremonies. It was here that the Emancipation Rally was to be held. That day was surrounded by a great press of people. Some were already in the main room of the building, while others clamoured to enter. The air was filled with the aromas from the coal pots of the vendors, delicacies such as the fishy akra lamoubi, honey sweet plantain fries, spicy boudin noir and callaloo. Soon the hall, gaily decorated with flags and bunting, was packed, and the program began with a prayer, and then a singing of the hymn from Greenland's icy mountains. Ralph Casimir, in his speech, surveyed the condition of the race from slavery to the present. He spoke of the history of slavery in the West Indies, during which the Negro had been so harshly treated in the name of Christianization. Despite freedom from slavery in the West Indies and the United States, he said Negroes did not enjoy freedom in any real sense, as they were denied the very essence of liberty and were still political serfs, denied a voice in their own government. The only recourse he saw was to follow the leadership of Marcus Garvey. "We have been taught the old lesson," he said. "Britons shall never more be slaves, but certainly, in a sense, we Britons of the dark race are not free people. Not being free in the land of other races, we should rightly claim Africa for our home." He continued by saying that all should rally to Garvey's call. This is the race which he is fighting for, and I'm asking you to join. Negroes were not cowards either in France, Flanders, or Mesopotamia. We should not shrink from the present fight for the possession of our own motherland. He ended with a rallying call for all present to join the association in the knowledge that there were others gathered this very day in New York and other West Indian islands discussing liberty and democracy for the Negro race. Here is a photograph of the variety, some of the actors in the variety show they had that evening. And seated at the front are Ralph Casimir and his sister Meredith. His mother is behind his sister. I suspect that the young boy on the left is his younger brother, but I do not know who the other people are. And next to that is the variety program. It's quite interesting because we published that on Facebook, and a few people recognise their grandparents as having taken part in that variety performance. By late 1922, the membership had become restless. There was no sign of the promised Black Star Line in which many had so faithfully invested. Casimir felt harried on all sides by the membership, who believed that they had been let down both by him and by the UNIA. He wrote to the parent body of the UNIA explaining the situation and requesting them to send a high-ranking official to help them to resolve the issues that plagued the UNIA in Dominica. The response was unhelpful. At that time, Marcus Garvey himself was facing charges of fraud. Caught in the middle of an unsolvable situation between the local membership and New York, and unable to hold the fracturing Dominica division together, and to expect support from the UNIA parent government, Grandpa resigned as president, and also from the Dominica UNIA division in early 1923. And here on this slide you can see Marcus Garvey being taken to be charged for what has turned out to be an unjust conviction for mail fraud in 1923. Despite the defeat, Grandpa continued to be actively involved in local politics and was unafraid to challenge corruption wherever it was. In the Marcus Garvey UNIA papers, Grandpa's contribution to the UNIA has been very widely celebrated, and partly because he kept such extraordinary records and was so well known within the region, because he influenced not only the development in Dominica but in other Caribbean islands, in particular in Trinidad. In 1932, he helped to organize and was present at the first West Indian Conference. He was deeply committed to Haile Selassie and Ethiopia's quest for freedom from the Italian occupation, and he was active and in campaigning as a town councillor, and his political involvement carried well on into the 1950s, when he petitioned and fought for housing development in Pottersville and Goodwill. And here's a photograph of those who attended the 1932 West Indian Conference, and I've got a little red arrow just above the head of my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was not only a political activist, and most of you will possibly have heard about him as might be more familiar with the fact that he wrote poetry. But that too, in many ways, was linked to the UNIA. There was a section of the Negro World dedicated to poetry, and the UNIA and the Harlem Renaissance are inextricably linked. Ralph Casimir was a determined man who believed that against all odds, ordinary Dominicans could be writers and poets. His efforts in this were recognized and appreciated both in Dominica and in the wider Caribbean and in the US. It is in this respect that Alec Lazar, Dominican writer and a former leading civil servant, referred to Casimir as the grandfather of Dominican literature. Alwyn Bully, former chief cultural officer of Dominica, has also described him to me as the pioneer of Dominican literature. The Negro World was much more than just an organ for the rallying cry of the UNIA. The paper published poems, short stories, book reviews, and articles about works of literature. It was also a forum for literary critics such as Zora Neale Hurston, author and anthropologist, Arthur Schomburg, historian and archivist, Alan Locke, philosopher and activist, were among the well-known figures who wrote for it regularly. It was a space also in which aspiring writers, such as Casimir, from the African diaspora, could publish their work. This plethora of black writers of the time, through the medium of the Negro World, helped to usher in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s with an unparalleled promotion of African conscious literary activity. Garvey defined the aesthetic of this literary offensive in his essay on African fundamentalism. The time has come for the Negro to forget and cast behind him his hero worship and adoration of other races, and to start out immediately to create and emulate heroes of his own. We must canonize our own saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate to positions of fame and honor black men and women who have made their distinct contributions to our racial history. We must inspire in our literature and promulgate a doctrine of our own without any apologies to the powers that be. The right is ours and God's. Let contrary sentiment and cross opinions go to the winds. Casimir's writings for the Negro World would have placed him at the hub of black literary life at the time, despite his geographical isolation. Indeed, Tony Martin, the Trinidadian-born scholar of African studies who died in 2013, described him as being one of the most prolific Negro world poets. Casimir produced and published poetry for more than 7 decades, from 1919 to 1995, both locally and internationally, sometimes writing under the pseudonym of Civis Africanus, citizen of Africa. He published 9 anthologies of his own work, and also edited and contributed to 4 anthologies of the writing of Dominican poets. Daniel Talley and Edward Scobie are perhaps one of the 2 most famous poets who were included in the anthologies, which were called Poesy 1, Poesy 2, Poesy 3, Poesy 4. They were also an anthology of Dominican verse. He was also called, many of you may have heard of Langston Hughes, who is well known as being a great poet of the Highland Renaissance. And he was also someone who Grandpa corresponded with. They wrote to each other quite regularly, and this is just an extract from one of his letters. He also sent him photographs, and they often would send each other Christmas greetings. Another dear friend of his was Phyllis Chandolfrey, who knew that he was, they were political and also literary friends, because they were both members of the Freedom Party. And this poem, Gentleness of Friends, is a poem which Phyllis Chandolfrey wrote to my grandfather on his 80th birthday, and presented him with one of her own anthologies called Palm Oak. Recognition for my grandfather on the island came late in life. I think Dominicans didn't know about this part of their history until Tony Martin's essay, which was serialized in the Chronicle in the 1990s, called A Pan-African in Dominica. And then my grandfather, and also my grandfather received the Golden Drum Award in 1984. It's difficult sometimes to know why he was ignored, but I think that sometimes, it depends on what questions one asks, what you're looking for when you're writing a history, really. But my grandfather I was very happy to know my grandfather till the end of his life. And he felt that he had made a contribution. And he would sometimes say, I used to be a firebrand in my youth. Thank you all for listening.
My friend Kathy is a great speaker, and it was so illuminating and engaging. Thank you so much. And I did actually forget to thank Alliance Forces for providing this room, and also to the family and friends of Kathy who've helped make this all possible. Thank you all so much.
There's Jennifer over there.
Yes,
we want
Jennifer.
to say Jennifer. And thank you for helping me with my printing this morning, Michael.
So many people have contributed. Thank you so much. I don't know if there are any questions before we go and eat on this beautiful looking spread and have more to drink. Is there anything else, anything that people would like to ask or comment on?
don't be afraid to disagree with me.
Or shall we just talk amongst
I
ourselves?
think just people
Fine.
can talk amongst
So-
themselves and help themselves to all the lovely food and drink. And maybe, if you would like to, the Polly has books at the back, which you're very welcome to
Oh yeah, I
purchase.
forgot about that. Yes. Please.
Not the one who's supposed to
Thank
say
you.
that, not me.
Yes, I know. I completely forgot. Please come and buy the book. It's for today only. It's $30. And Kathy, I know will want to sign if you'd like to ask her.
If anyone wants that.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry, before I didn't notice Bernard in the audience. Bernard helped me with my research. I was very lucky to be able to interview him. Well, yes. I think, to be fair to him, he was caught between he had a business to run. He was a lawyer, you know, and his client, he says, his client was and in fact, once he will read the book, you will see that in 1923, that he actually invited my grandfather back to work with him. My grandmother was an incredibly efficient and organized person. He had every paper, every letter that was written to him, copies of those people, and his collection of all his letters and poems are on the Schomburg Center for History and Culture of Black. And so, more invited
Alright everyone, this was the book launching of The Black Man Listen, The Life of Ralph Casimir by Casimir MacLean. This will be the ending of our live. This live was also brought to you by Emonews, and this live was taking place at Alliance Forces. Once again, this is a live broadcast of the launching of The Black Man Listen, The Life of Ralph Casimir by Casimir MacLean. Once again, this live was brought to you by Emonews. Thanks for watching.